Ok. ¿Dónde está el link? Saúl, ¿tú puedes jalar ese link para subirlo?
¿En dónde lo pusieron? A ver si yo lo puedo ver por acá.
Ahorita lo pongo en el chat.
El chat
Ahorita
sí
lo pongo
pueden
en el
ver
chat.
fácil. Si lo pueden copiar y pegar y ahorita lo posteo en redes.
Yo creo que, bueno, tenemos un minutito.
Ahí está.
Ok. ¿Escuchan eso? ¿Ustedes escuchan eso? ¿Sí? El clink, clink. ¿Sí?
Sí, lo escucho.
Ok.
So, welcome everyone. Bienvenidos a todos. As you are coming in, make sure to follow the instructions for your language. Así como van entrando, por favor, sigan las instrucciones para escuchar el evento en el idioma. So if you want to listen in English, please follow the instructions of how to listen the event in English. Si lo quieren escuchar en español, por favor, sigan las instrucciones de español.
So we're going to wait, what, 1 minute, 2 minutes?
Just one more minute, but similarly.
Can you hear me?
Sí.
Sam?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Spanish? Are you in the Spanish channel?
Sí, te escuchamos, Aira.
Do you want to move?
I am in the original audio, so as people are entering, just making sure that they go to the right place.
Okay.
Just give me a second. Yeah, in 1 more minute. Hola a todos, bienvenidos. Hi everyone, welcome. Just remember, if you want to listen the event in English, follow the English instructions. Bienvenidos a todos. Si quieren escuchar el idioma, el evento en español, por favor sigan las instrucciones en español.
Gracias, Omar.
Hello, everyone.
You should see my shorts. Hi, Suping.
Can you
Hi,
hear me
everybody.
okay?
Yeah, we're doing
Great,
okay.
okay.
How's everyone that is just joining? It's good to see you, as always, from wherever you are. Suping, are you still in El Paso?
I'm in Baltimore. That's my new office. That's why I have
Where?
Baltimore, Maryland.
Oh, you're in Maryland. Oh my
Yeah.
God. Okay, that's far away. I'm glad you're joining us today. I thought you're still in El Paso. I don't know why. I mean, are you still so close and you're still
No, I
working?
just moved. I just moved recently. Yeah, I was in El Paso. Yeah. I joined Morgan State University.
Yeah. Is it cool? cooler in Texas?
It's a
Everything's
cooler, wet, green.
Wet and green. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we're ready.
So everyone that is just joining in, please just follow the instructions for the interpretation. If you want to hear your interpretation in English, please select the interpretation button, select the English, and make sure you mute your original audio.
I think let's
If you want to listen in Spanish, Sam is going to give instructions for that as well.
So let's go ahead, Rosario, and let's start the event.
Okay, Maggie. So thank you everyone again for joining us to this coffee break of the Permanent Forum of Binational Waters. Today we're going to talk about a very strategic, important, key element these days during the drought that we are suffering in both international basins. Environmental flows become very, very important to talk about, and we have excellent speakers today. We want to thank our sponsors, as always, California Institute for Water Resources Research Center from Arizona, Texas Water Resources Institute, and North American Development Bank, and all the volunteers, of course, that have donated to the forum. Thank you. And if you're interested in donating, please just follow the instructions that are going to appear in the chat if you want to donate to the forum. Next, Gabby. And well, myself, Rosario Sanchez, I'm the director of the Permanent Forum Binational Waters, and I'm going to introduce Sam because I don't like to introduce myself. He is our associate director of the forum. He's responsible for the Water Management and Policy Research Program at the University of California, Agriculture and Natural Resources Division. He's working on strategies to improve the water management for anthropogenic and environmental requirements by developing reservoir reoperation policies to improve the human and environmental water requirements. So this topic is actually very, very keen to Samuel's research interests.
Yeah, gracias, Rosario. Thanks, Rosario. Rosario, she's has more than 15 years in work in transboundary issues, very good background in terms of diplomacy, hydrology, research. She has worked quite extensively in the transboundary aquifer assessment. So the two of us will be leading this event, but before doing that, Saul, could you go to the next one? Yep. So we have a new member of the Permanent Forum, Kevin Perez, and he's now our fundraiser coordinator, and as all of us doing everything that is needed. So it is very versatile. A program specialist at New Mexico Water Resources Research Institute, and a master's student in water science and management at NMSU. In his research, he's interested in understanding the spatial and temporal dynamics of the surface water and groundwater through models and data. And Kevin, I know that you are somewhere there. Do you want to introduce yourself to the community?
Yeah, hello everyone. Yeah, I work for the New Mexico Water Resources Research
We can't hear you, Kevin.
You can hear me?
I can.
I think.
Is it me that I can't?
No,
I can
Kevin,
hear.
creo que estás en el.
Kevin, make sure you have selected the English. The English interpretation button.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Okay, go.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Recently, I decided to join the forum to help with some volunteering in fundraising. And as Samuel said, I work for the New Mexico Water Resources Research Institute, and I am also a student at New Mexico State University. And yeah, my expectation is to help the forum and learn as much as possible about transboundary waters.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, really. We're grateful to have you part of the team. So thank you.
Bienvenido.
Bienvenido. And now we're going to go ahead and introduce our speakers for today. I'm going to start with Stephanie Paladino. She is an environmental anthropologist, often found with her hands and feet in the dirt. You can see that in the picture. She's worked with farmers, fishers, forest users, and diverse international contexts. Her interests are questions of governance, equity, rights, sustainability, knowledge, livelihood, and identity. She especially looks at the resources of both conflict and collaboration in these arenas. She's participated in a multidisciplinary study of water management in the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo Basin, as well as studies of the social implications of carbon, agroforestry, conservation policies, extractive industries, and watershed management. Thank you, Stephanie, for being with us today. Our next guest is Jack Schmidt, which I know is John Schmidt, but every John is a Jack. That's what I learned yesterday. So thank you, Jack, for being with us today. He's professor at Utah State University. He's Janet Quinney Lawson Chair in Colorado River Studies, and he leads the Center for Colorado River Studies at Utah State University. He has worked for nearly 40 years on the large rivers of the Western United States. Between 2005 and 2015, he led a research program on the Rio Grande, Bravo, in the Big Bend region, focused on hydrology, sediment transport, river geomorphology, and river rehabilitation. He has worked throughout the Colorado River, especially in Grand Canyon and on the Green River. He served as chief of the U.S. Geological Service Grand Canyon Monitoring and Research Center between 2011 and 2014. He received the National Park Service Director's Award for Natural Resource Research in 2009 and was co-recipient of the Department of Interior Partners in Conservation Award for his work in planning and studying the 2014 pulse flow release from Morelos Dam in the Colorado River Delta. Historic. Our next speaker, Sam, do you want to introduce Almee?
Yeah, Amy Roberson. It is definitely a pleasure to introduce Amy. Yeah, she's been a long-lasting Rio Grande water warrior that we've been working together for a long time. Amy is a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of the Oklahoma and the Chickasaw Descent. She serves as the Southwest Regional Director for American Bird Conservancy. Previously, she served as the Rio Grande Joint Venture Coordinator, and prior to that, worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Amy is a lifelong student of the Earth's wisdom and holds degrees in geology and conservation biology. She is committed to reciprocity, community, and environmental stewardship, and partners with people and all our relations to ensure that the native grasses grow and rivers continue to flow. Amy, thanks for bringing such an important perspective to the environmental flows, and also to bring all the expertise that you have had for a long time. I mean, more than 15, 20 years. So our last speaker is another good friend, Oscar Leal, also another water warrior for some time in Cuatro Ciénegas and the Rio Bravo. So freshwater program coordinator at Pronatura Noreste. He is a biologist graduated from Universidad Michoacana de San Nicolás de Hidalgo, with a master's degree in environmental geography from the National Autonomous University of Mexico and the ITC of the Netherlands. And he also holds a PhD in water science and technology from INTA, from the Mexican Institute of Water Technology. He works as coordinator of the Pronatura Noreste water program, implementing wetland conservation and restoration strategies, developing governance and water security projects in northeastern Mexico. In Pronatura, a good stronghold for an NGOs on the Mexican side. He represents the Environmental Committee in the Rio Bravo Basin Council, where he promotes the inclusion of ecological flows in the surface water distribution policy of the basin, something that I've been witness of. So to the four of you, welcome, bienvenidos. And let's just go directly to the questions. And so our first questions, 3 minutes each. is explain the concept of environmental flows and how it relates to the transboundary ecosystems or the society or the governance structures and water agreements. So let's start actually in the order that you were introduced. So shall we start with Stephanie?
Hola a todos y todas. Thank you for inviting me.
Stephanie, we cannot
Yes.
hear you. And I think we
Okay.
cannot hear you because.
No,
Okay.
we hear her.
Okay,
You know?
now.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I wanted to listen in both languages, but I guess I need to pick one. So, ¿todos me escuchan? Everybody hears me? Okay, gracias. So I took this opportunity to, this question as an opportunity to talk a little bit about the social landscape, right? Just kind of put a little background to it. And then, and there's so much to talk about, but I'll just pick a couple of things. And so one of those is very well known to most of us, to all of us who work in that area, and that is the fact that the water system governance in the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo Basin is so focused on water, providing water or managing water for agriculture, right? So agriculture is at the center. Of course, there are other uses for surface water, but we know that 80 to 90% goes to agriculture. So. And that goes with the water rights systems. So, even though there's a few uses you can justify your water use in Mexico and in the US, but in the US in particular, it's very focused on water for consumptive uses, for productive uses, usually meaning particular economic values. And also very much dependent on requiring diversion from river flows. So that's pretty important and relevant in relation to environmental flows, that a lot of these water rights are based on that. And really the system is not, as most of you know already, it's not really built with environmental flows in mind, right? It's all very much focused incrementally developed over decades and now centuries on managing water sharing and water use for agriculture for the most part in terms of surface water, right? So I don't know, I'm going to try to do this in 3 minutes. Another point that I'd like to bring out is if we're putting agriculture at the center, then it's really important to think of the diversity of farming systems that exist in the basin. And it might be helpful to think about a spectrum and think about at one end farming systems that have origins in Native American and Spanish colonial times that are very old and that are usually relatively small scale, and they are very much adapted to the natural hydrographic flow. Yes, thank you. I see here somewhere, but yes. So it's very much adapted around the natural pulses and timing of and flows in the systems. And that means that it just, you've got gravity, usually gravity fed distribution of water within the floodplain. But on the other end of the spectrum, we have farming systems that have come up since mostly, beginning in the late 1800s, but mostly in the 1900s. And since then, that now invest a whole lot in water storage and distribution infrastructure, and now can bring hundreds and hundreds of hectares or thousands of hectares, even in some cases, of land under agriculture that doesn't even have to be near the river, right? Now you can pump it, now you can store it. So these are and then there's farming systems along that spectrum in different places. And that's true in both countries. So it's good to think about that because I want us to think about that, because if we get to a point where we're thinking of environmental flows as in conflict or in competition with agricultural water use, then it's important to think about how these systems are different and the different things they may have at stake, the different objectives they may have, the different ways they might evaluate risk, and also to what extent they're already kind of aligned with the natural water flow, and to what extent they're not. And we can come back and talk about that. Do I have another minute? Okay. No?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay.
I know you, go for it.
So the only other two things I was going to mention now is, of course, we know that there's also increasing urban populations in these areas, and that has put another pressure on the water source. But it's also created this system, this thing, at least in the US, where you have people wanting to access water rights that were agricultural and now acquire them and move that water to other places. So that's like another place where the use of water and environmental flows and natural flows and stream flows are being kind of divided. And the last thing I'll add is just the importance of identity. So in a lot of these places, people are very strongly identified with their way of life, with agriculture. Some of them are more strongly identified with the river and the place that the river and its ecosystem create, and some are less identified with the river ecosystem, but still very much with farming as a way of life. So. Yeah.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias. Thanks a lot. But I think that was a good summary of, a very brief overview of the Rio Grande and environmental flows and the other actors. Let's go with Jack. Explain the concept of environmental flows and how it relates to the transboundary ecosystem, society, governance structures, and water agreements. No, Jack, first unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now? Okay. It's great to see some old friends. It's been quite a while since I worked on the Rio Grande, and it is great to see that some of you are still at it. It's such an important resource. Let me just try to be direct here. What do I think environmental flows are? I think environmental flows are river flows dedicated to achieving some ecological or natural resource benefit. In systems like the Rio Grande that have been significantly perturbed for more than a century, and for which there's an international treaty, there's no going back to pre-disturbance conditions to identify what the standard of our goal is. And therefore, it forces us to define our goals. And that's a daunting thing, because that means that humans need to identify what they want. And that's the only way that we can evaluate for what purpose would we ever have an environmental flow. And so we should keep that in mind. I would urge us to be geographically specific in where we're talking. The El Paso Juarez Valley, the river is the ecosystem is essentially destroyed. In the Forgotten Reach, the river has no water, but it's become a tiny little river that might actually be functioning. It's just a different river. In the Big Bend, downstream of Ojinaga, the river is entirely simply the continuance of the Rio Conchos. The northern branch in New Mexico has nothing to do with the river in the Big Bend. And then, of course, in the lower canyons, the river is somewhat more wild. I would remind everybody that the definition of goals is something we've been aware of for a long time. And in 2011, we wrote what I thought a simple and articulate goal for ecosystem, e-flows, and restoration in the Big Bend region. And I presume you are well familiar with that, and that you have sought to define similar goals for the other segments of the river. E-flows need to address more than just the quantification of minimum base flows. We need to think about whether we're only focusing e-flows on native species, whether we're focusing e-flows on recreation and canoeing, whether we're talking about reestablishing long lost parts of the hydrograph like the snowmelt flood from the Rocky Mountains. One obviously needs to worry about the role of floods, And there's a challenge in understanding how we develop e-flows in a system that is a disequilibrium river system. We can talk about that later. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. Gracias, Jack. And I think it's important, as you're mentioning, to know where or to mention where we're talking, because it looks different. Also, I mean, because this is throughout it's a permanent forum of binational waters, also feel free to talk about the Colorado, because that is also part of or one part of the story. So let's actually go with Amy. Amy, can you talk with us about these topics, please?
Absolutely. Hola a todos. Hello, everyone. And thank you so much for this opportunity to discuss this very important topic. First, I'd like to say that I'm not sure the term environmental flows is the best term to use. It seems to have some kind of stigma around it. And I think this is because many people see themselves as somehow separate from the environment. And so they may not understand how flows for the environment would benefit themselves. If we talk about perhaps functional flows or something like that, perhaps more people can start to see the importance of a functioning system to all of us. So functional flows on the international segment of the Rio Grande would mean that when possible, treaty deliveries are happening in a way that supports the overall functioning of the ecosystem, thereby allowing the Rio to do her job. For example, evacuating sediment to the Gulf, minimizing the negative impact of floods, keeping the water clean, providing habitat for native plants and wildlife, and supporting riverside communities and agriculture. From my perspective, water is not just a commodity or resource to be extracted from the river for human use. If we continue to manage the water in this way, the river will die. And if we kill her, we will kill our communities. We need to stop fighting over water and work together to ensure that the Rio and the people, wildlife, and plants that depend on her are able to persist into the future. This is not going to be easy, especially as the climate is changing and we are in a mega drought. But where would it leave us in our communities throughout the basin if we allow the river to dry up or become merely a conveyance channel that occasionally passes water from reservoir to reservoir? I don't think anyone wants that. Even those who might primarily be concerned about how much water they can extract from the river would suffer under this scenario. I have been living and working in the Rio Grande Basin for more than 20 years. The Rio Grande flows through the middle of my heart. And I don't think I'm the only one that feels this way. In fact, I think there might be millions of people who feel this way. As Stephanie mentioned, so many people relate to the river as part of their identity. The river is so important to our communities, our cultures, our economies, and ways of life. It doesn't belong to any one of us, but we all depend on her. And we should all be thinking about what we can give back to her. I believe we need to look to the people who are indigenous to this basin and who have lived with the Rio Grande for millennia to help us understand how to be in right relationship with her. From an indigenous perspective, we recognize our responsibility to the river because we know that we depend on her. We have a responsibility to maintain a reciprocal relationship and take care of her just as she takes care of us. I think water managers and all of us would do well to consider this way of thinking. Thank you.
Amy, thanks a lot for bringing that a very clear perspective. I do also think that, yeah, sometimes we carry baggage on the environmental flows. I think functional flows or a functioning river is important to keep in mind, and that making sure that pointing out that the good that we treat Mother Nature will treat us the same. So thanks, Amy. Now let me go to Oscar, por favor. Tu turno.
Gracias, Sam. Antes que nada, un placer compartir este foro con los ponentes. Gracias por la invitación. Y pues bueno, de aquí nos trae un tema muy querido por nosotros, ¿no? Y por el cual pues hemos trabajado tanto en la cuenca del río Bravo. Yo quisiera empezar comentando que pues el principal y el primer usuario del agua en la cuenca fue el ambiente, ¿no? Si bien ahora, al parecer, pues es el último, en un principio pues fue el principal, fue el que utilizaba todo el agua. El problema que nos ha llevado a la situación de los flujos ambientales es básicamente que, como lo mencionó Stephanie, es que la forma en que se ha venido haciendo la gestión del agua, tanto en Estados Unidos como en México, pues ha sido desde una perspectiva ingenieril, una perspectiva desde cómo vamos a suplir el agua a los principales usuarios, como en este caso, igual que en Estados Unidos, pues en México es el agrícola. Entonces, básicamente, aquí en México se desarrolló todo el tema de las presas, el tema de las entregas de agua, pues para cumplir con los usuarios agrícolas. Después de un tiempo, nos damos cuenta que no podemos seguir así, pero pues ahora la situación es que básicamente todo el agua de la cuenca está concesionada a todos los usuarios, ¿no? En México existe más agua en papel de la que hay físicamente. Es una cuenca sobreconcesionada, por lo cual pues es muy complicado, y más ahorita en términos de la sequía que estamos atravesando, restringir a los usuarios de su agua para decirles, ¿sabes qué? Esta parte de agua pues va a ser para el medio ambiente. Entonces, es básicamente imposible. En México se hizo una modificación en el artículo 4 de la Constitución, en donde se establece el derecho humano al agua y saneamiento y al derecho humano al medio ambiente. Y si bien se entiende porque está en el mismo artículo que hay una resonancia entre estos dos statements, no lo es. Realmente, pues hay una competencia entre ambos. Nunca está, digamos, a la par el derecho humano al agua y el derecho humano a un medio ambiente sano. Siempre hay una competencia. Y cuando estos temas se llevan a los foros de discusión, generalmente el derecho humano al agua siempre estará por encima al derecho humano a un medio ambiente sano, que es básicamente el tener los flujos ambientales que garanticen los servicios ecosistémicos a las poblaciones. En la cuenca del río Bravo, pues básicamente pues, tenemos distintos tipos de usuarios, pero también hay que recordar que el primer usuario, de acuerdo a las leyes que nos rigen, pues es el Tratado de 1944. Entonces, de hecho, cuando se realiza un trabajo, cuando se realiza el trabajo de determinación de flujos ambientales en el Consejo de Cuenca, siempre el primer usuario que se toma en cuenta es el del tratado, ¿no? Y pues bueno, de acuerdo con esto, pues una de las situaciones que también pasa muy a menudo aquí en la cuenca es la politización del tema del agua, ¿no? Y de los caudales ambientales. Si bien todo mundo está de acuerdo de que los caudales ambientales son necesarios, en el momento en que se van a hacer o se discute la priorización, pues siempre el usuario ambiental viene siendo el último. Entonces es uno de los problemas que nosotros tenemos aquí y que, pues bueno, básicamente que es una de las cosas que compartimos también con Estados Unidos. Pero ahorita dejo mi participación. Gracias.
Gracias, Oscar. Thank you. So let's actually go to the next one, because I'm seeing that it is we're running out of time, but let's go back to many of you have already discussed about it, which is what are the challenges to implement environmental flows? Let's go exactly in the same order. Stephanie, I know that you allude some of that. Could you go ahead on it?
Sure. Gracias. I mean, there are so many challenges, right? But I would like to kind of build off of some of what people have been saying and add to that. And as we know, I mean, of course, the system of treaties and pacts and water rights and all that is so entrenched and so slow to change. It's like a hard shell that, is going to take a while to move. That and the fact that groundwater and surface water have been being managed separately for a long time and is only just now beginning to be looked at together. And I mention that because as more demands on surface water come up, a lot of folks, a lot of farmers, but not all farmers have options to pump groundwater. And we know that there can be connections, right, in a lot of places. But I think what really struck me in one place where I have a concurrence is both Amy and Jack mentioned, Jack mentioned goals, like defining the goals, like talking about what are we trying to achieve here, and the fact that what we can and might achieve is perhaps different than what it was in the past. What we can imagine is probably different now than what we could imagine before. And that Amy mentioned problems with the concept of environmental flows. And for me, that is a big challenge, apart from the technical issues, that I think when I'm out in the river basin, when I'm talking to people, I often hear advocates for river restoration or environmental flows. I hear them talk about a healthy ecosystem or a healthy river, and make an assumption in their way of speaking that this is a good thing for everybody, a positive thing for everybody. And I'm not sure that everybody, I feel like that is something that needs to be, that is not really clear in a lot of ways. So like, what does it mean to have a healthy ecosystem? Healthy to whom? Who decides that? Who decides what that's going to look like? And really making, I feel like we don't make the connections, explicit connections between how this healthy river system or restored environmental flows or preserved environmental flows, how that actually benefits farmers or people who are living in the system. So it's easy for a scientist to take it as a given, perhaps, in their frame of mind, but it's not necessarily a given to everyone else. And I think that's a weak point. But very bottom line is, who's going to decide that? How does that get decided? What values, what is prioritized in that? Another challenge that I wanted to mention is talk about a little bit is that when we think of that diversity, ways that people are farming or people are using water, that there's a lot of uncertainty. And a lot of times people talk about loss of water rights as, the use it or lose it thing, that's a prime driver in people's behavior or decision-making. And it is an important one. But it also is important to realize that a lot of people, it's not like your desk job. Like if I lose my desk job, I still have my skills. I know how to use a computer. I know how to research. I can maybe move to another part of the country, right? But farming and the people who farm, even the ones that have less depth of generations doing it, are very strongly identified in what they do, and their land and what they're doing on it is those are their skills that aren't necessarily portable everywhere. I think I'll just leave it at that because I'm probably gone over my time, but we'll get back to those things incrementally.
Stephanie, great points. And I mean, as I'm seeing here, between the treaties, this connection of surface water, groundwater, even just talking about environmental flows and just having a given that it is just a positive thing. So anyway, thanks for bringing that up. Jack, I mean, you have a lot of experience. So what are the challenges to implement environmental flows?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, this is all a challenge in 3 minutes. All right, let me, as a guy who does live on the political side of this now, let me go back to being just a scientific nerd for a minute. First off, reminder, we absolutely have to have clear objectives for the e-flows. And these objectives are likely to be different in different parts of the rivers we work at. On the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo, in many ways, the biggest challenge is that this is a disequilibrium channel that is continually changing and losing channel capacity as sediment overwhelms the system. A typical E-flow analysis is based on identifying flows needed to inundate a floodplain. You can't quantify things when the channel capacity constantly changes. The other thing we know about the hydrology of the system is that every 10 to 20 years, the entire system gets reamed out by a hurricane flood. Those things are damaging to humans and hugely beneficial ecologically. And the whole reset of the E-flows concept has to be considered. And it all ultimately for the Big Bend has to be linked to reservoir releases on the conchos and implementation of the treaty, which is hugely complicated. But the last thing I want to point out is most identifications of E-flows are paper exercises, not backed up by science. And if we're going to deal with real world policymakers and people making sacrifices, the scientific community needs to know precisely how much water they need. They need to speak to the effectiveness of it, and they need to work in that policy context. I want to remind you all that the great, wonderful 2014 pulse flow release from Morelos, I was there. It was one of the most wonderful things I participated in. What did we learn more than anything? We learned that that release of water from Morelos Dam is a lost cause of wasting water. And what is the E-flow prescription now for the Delta? Route all the water through irrigation canals to individual plots. And the idea of routing water down the river has been completely abandoned because it's a real world, and that's the best we can do. And I'm going to say that the first step in implementing E-flows on the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo is there has to be one singular event like the 2014 pulse flow, in which the environmental and science community demonstrates the capacity to measure what the hell happens, what good it makes, did it make it better, that they can work together, that they can analyze data, they can write a report, they can deal with IBWC and CELA in negotiating something for the future. And in the absence of not even having one scientific experiment to know what the hell we're talking about, this is risks being a paper exercise for a long time.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. And I mean, I think it is from the perspective that you're bringing it. Yeah, we need to have clear objectives. Is it moving sediment? Is it inundating floods? Is it, what are those? And then from that, also trying to balance some of the benefits for the environment and what can affect other users. And yes, I agree that there should be pilot programs or adaptive management to start sending some water and monitor it. So, Amy, what are the hurdles to get environmental flows on the ground?
Yeah, well, I definitely agree with everything that's been said so far. And of course, there are many, many challenges. And, you know, I'll emphasize this again, as I mentioned previously, and Stephanie talked about, I think one of the biggest challenges is that people don't understand how environmental flows would benefit them. We're basically witnessing the tragedy of the commons. Somehow we need to get the message across that people are not separate from ecosystems. We are part of them, we are supported by them, and we have a role to play in their proper functioning. We people in general, we haven't been doing a very good job of fulfilling our stewardship role. Then, as we all know, the water in the basin is over allocated, over committed. Combine this with the mega drought and a changing climate, and here we are already in big, big trouble. There's not enough water to go around in good years, much less in a drought. So what are we going to do? Continue to fight about it? Who is going to win that fight? Possibly no one. An alternative would be to work together to keep the river alive and at the same time achieve goals described in the Minute 325, the recent Minute 325 of the Treaty of 1944, which specifically sets the goal to establish mechanisms for future cooperation to improve the predictability and reliability of Rio Grande water deliveries to users in the United States and Mexico. I think we are most likely to achieve these goals if we work together on solving our collective problems. Of course, we are talking about transboundary decision-making, which is always challenging. I think we desperately need to move beyond us versus them attitudes and approaches. From my perspective, we need to recognize that we are all in this together. With the history of politics across the international border, as well as amongst the states in each of the countries, we essentially need to move forward into a new paradigm, a totally new approach toward cooperation and sustainability. Is it going to be easy? Obviously not. Is it impossible? I hope not. I don't think so, but it's not easy, obviously. And then finally, as I've heard Jack Schmidt say in the past, we don't even know if it's possible to create a mini version of the river through managed flows and produce a functional lift. In other words, can we mimic the shape of a natural hydrograph at a reduced level of flows and expect the river to function better than she currently does? Some of us think so, as Jack was speaking to, but even when we apply the best available science, what we think is possible is only a hypothesis. This means that functional flow recommendations at this point are just hypotheses that need to be tested. I hope we get a chance to test them, like Jack was talking about, to work collaboratively with people in Mexico and the US to come up with flow scenarios that can be tested through adaptive management and monitoring. This would ideally be done in a balanced way, in a transparent partnership setting in which the views, values, and interests of people from all sectors are considered. And we do have the precedent set for binational environmental flows on the Colorado River Delta. And a lot of the things learned over there can be applied here on the Rio Grande. Thank you.
Amy, great points. And I mean, some of the common things that so what does sea-flow means and the different interpretations of how can benefit the society or the people there, all the way to I really like the work together. We're in it all together. And I think that's a good changing of mindset. And yeah, regardless of what part of the river you are, we are in it together. You're also already start mentioning some of the solutions, as I think Stephanie and Jack, so we're going a little bit ahead, but let's actually talk also with Oscar, who has seen a lot of the struggles to develop environmental flows. So Oscar, could you go ahead?
Sí, gracias, Sam. Pues bueno, ya había yo comentado en mi participación anterior algunos de los retos. Creo que el principal reto, por lo menos a lo que atañe a México, es el tratado. Es que es una cuenca sujeta a un tratado en donde generalmente los usuarios lo ven como una paga de algo que alguien más está recibiendo en el río Colorado, ¿no? Entonces, desde esa perspectiva, pues bueno, es un reto entender a los usuarios que pues realmente el agua que está pasando por sus parcelas, pues no es de ellos, corresponde a un tratado. Como ya lo había comentado también, es que, pues bueno, es una cuenca sobreconcesionada y esto hace que realmente el reto para los caudales ambientales pues sea mayor. ¿Por qué? Porque ahorita, digamos que no habría la posibilidad de destinar flujos ante que sean caudales ambientales. O sea, por ejemplo, que si ya está concesionado todo el agua, no hay agua de la cual se pueda derivar para una concesión ambiental. Existe la forma en México a través de la adquisición de derechos, como en el caso de Pronatura Noreste, en la cual tenemos un caudal en el área de Cuatro Ciénegas que fue cambiado, fue un volumen agrícola que fue cambiado a uso ambiental. Pero esa es, digamos, una de las formas. La otra forma que en México se ha utilizado es la designación de reservas. La designación de reservas únicamente ha sido en áreas en cuencas que tienen disponibilidad de agua. Entonces, prácticamente la cuenca del río Bravo no es factible este esquema para designar caudales para el uso ambiental. Entonces, bueno, se han hecho también estudios de caudales ecológicos, como por ejemplo en el caso del río Conchos, pero el tema, digamos, no es conocer o va más allá de conocer qué cantidad de flujos se requieren para la vida, ¿sí? ¿Por qué? Porque, bueno, es un estudio que ya tiene mucho tiempo, es un estudio que determina cómo son los caudales, pero ahorita en lo que estamos detenidos es de qué manera podemos llevar del papel a la aplicación en las políticas. Entonces, ese es, digamos, lo que yo considero el reto más grande. Y el reto más grande porque no solamente estamos hablando de un solo usuario, y es un reto muy grande para el uso ambiental en México, y lo digo así porque en la ley de aguas nacionales el uso ambiental está en el 6º lugar de prelación. Está por debajo del doméstico, del público urbano, del pecuario, del agrícola, de acuacultura, y posteriormente viene el uso ambiental. Entonces, esto dificulta de que cuando, digamos, ante alguna problemática que el agua sea recortada, el usuario ambiental, digamos, es uno de los últimos a los cuales se les pone atención. Entonces, esto requiere, digamos, más allá del conocimiento, en México se requiere de mucha voluntad política y de mucho trato entre los usuarios, de que entiendan de que realmente el usuario ambiental no es quien les va a quitar el agua, sino es quien les va a asegurar que el ecosistema siga proveyendo los servicios ecosistémicos, y al final ellos mismos o todos los usuarios de la cuenca nos vamos a beneficiar de esto. Y con esto coincido en lo que comentan los demás ponentes, que decir, bueno, vamos a definir bien cuáles son los objetivos para qué lo necesitamos, y el otro es que se entienda que el usuario ambiental o que los flujos ambientales no son algo que te van a quitar o un agua que te van a quitar, sino que es en el momento en que vas a aportar algo a manera de que pueda la cuenca ser sustentable para todos. Sí, muchas gracias.
Gracias, Oscar. Thank you. And I agree that, I mean, all the water comes from the environment. You name it. Environment is the provider. And we should be assigning water to our water provider. Anyway, Rosario, do you want to keep with the next one?
Yes, thank you, Sam. And thank you, everyone. And in a way to wrap up this first section of questions, and because we already talked a little bit about question number 3, which are the implications to implement environmental flows, considering the current drought, climate change, treaty agreements, and all that. And correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm hearing right now is that we don't even know if we actually would have the water to do something significant in the environment, right? That's what I'm getting right now. So the question would be: how are we dreaming about this? I mean, how far are we from this objective? We know we need it, but the current conditions, and then the climate trends, and then population growth, and then this competition over water, and there's more water and paper that is actually on the basin, on both basins actually. And we're only hearing about cutting water because there's no enough water in the system. And now we're talking about we actually need water for the environment or for the functionality of the system. So are we dreaming about this? I mean, is this actually possible? to see it in the short, medium term? I know this is a question that is not in your guidelines, but this is what we're hearing right now. It's like it's so complicated, this situation that we live right now, that to think about environmental flows or functional flows is actually not in the priority of the agenda. Would it be in the priority of the agenda? Do you see it coming? Or are we actually more, what is a realistic approach or a realistic scenario of what we are actually going to see happening? And with that, and I'm sorry I'm jumping out with this question, but I think that the discussion leads us to this question. And I'm going to start with Stephanie. Do you want to jump in?
Sure. And I'm glad you did actually move it past, move us down the road a little bit. Gag. I had my brain on something. I think, I mean, to me, I guess I would suggest, I don't know, obviously we don't know, is it just a dream? But I do think that one of the ways to kind of test it out a little bit or help us think further along is to look at some of the examples where people are finding room within the existing structures to push and pull and try to implement environmental flows on some level. And so those are so far very much restricted to one segment or another, sometimes a very, very small segment, like some tributary way up in the headlands where volume of water is maybe not quite as much of an issue as farther down. But I think they're instructive because of the way that they show us how did a specific group of people look at a set of different objectives and different goals that they had, and how did they, come together and to come up with something that would work, that would keep water in the stream and also meet other objectives. So some of those things are, like I say, on a very small scale, they're very specific to particular places, but I think they're really instructive. I think one of the things that is in common with a lot of them is that they are often, not exclusively, but often temporary arrangements. So in a setting where where there's a sense of competition, competition between agriculture and environmental flows, I mean, that's where it gets pressed towards. Then to, then it's worth looking at how that gets resolved. And I guess what I was going to say is that in terms of agricultural water rights and concesiones, there's a lot of uncertainty about the future and a lot of issues, including those identity and other issues. And so if there's a way to experiment on a temporary basis, renting water, leasing water rights for a purpose for a short amount of time, that allows that experiment to happen and to see what that looks like. I think there's a whole bunch of other ways where we've sort of been pushing, like moving the dial a little bit, the creation of special entities, like governmental or para-governmental entities to kind of look after in-stream flows and environmental flows is something that's instructive. I think I come down on the side of let's look at, let's experiment and let's look at what we're doing and try to learn as many lessons from those as we can. And my disclaimer is that I got a booster shot yesterday, COVID booster shot, and I actually have fever and I'm a little spaced out. So anyway, that's my excuse.
Sorry, Stephanie.
I cannot imagine how you are without the booster. So you're perfect.
Thank you.
Do you want to share your thoughts on this point? Yes.
Sorry. Yeah, let me just set my timer. Let me answer your question differently. Let me tell you my interpretation of the history of how a flow got released from Morelos Dam. And then you can ask yourself, how close are we on the Rio Grande? First off, it took tireless, quiet, poorly funded research, largely led by Ed Glenn at the University of Arizona, to quietly document that increased water flows in the 1990s brought riparian vegetation back to life. Published, hard-nosed, natural ecological science, hard-nosed science is needed to quantify flows to say, what do we need? Then it took the 2001 report by the Sonoran Institute that was a manifesto for bringing the Delta back to life and an identification of the amount of flow that was needed. And then to build a relentless campaign of relentless dialogue, no matter how much those people were told they were being silly and idealistic. Then what happened? Behind the scenes, the highest levels of the administration, all the way back to Dirk Kempthorne as Secretary of Interior, led to high-level negotiations between the federal governments and the state governments to get agreement. If you're not networked in at the highest levels, you got nothing going on. And then it took negotiation, and then it took an earthquake in Mexicali to destroy the system and then shift money to create a reason to let Mexican water be stored in Lake Mead, and then to begin to pass money, and then ultimately Minute 319 that included one tiny provision for one environmental flow. And then, I mean, I was part of what went on behind the scenes to pull that off. It was relentless, all consuming, went on for years. And the highest level of the states and the federal governments and the farmers all intervened to say, well, we're not doing that. And at some point, the decision was whatever we thought we needed for water, the higher level people said, this is how much water we negotiated. This is what you're going to get. You'll need to make the best out of this, period, end of story. And it's hard-nosed. It's not any of this other stuff. It's hard-nosed numbers. And then, of course, it took implementing it all. And in the Rio Grande, it's going to be hugely complicated because there's zero water in Elephant Butte. It's all got to come from the Rio Conchos. Don't kid yourself. And right now, that's politically impossible. And so the transformation is an enormous lift, but the whole thing's got to start with a compelling coffee table book that's on the desk of every decision maker in Mexico City and Washington, D.C., that lays out the case, identifies the water, and you build a massive public campaign for this. Thanks.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Jack. We needed to hear that example and how far are we from that. I mean the Rio Grande. Almee?
Thank you. Yeah, so of course it is extra challenging to try and change our way of relating to the Rio Grande when we are in a mega drought and facing big changes in the climate. But, you know, full disclosure, I tend to be an optimist, but I do think that this is really critical to continue to pursue this. With the severe drought and the climate change, we know that things are going to get harder. Hopefully, we will also have times when we are not in perpetual drought, and we need to come together in an inclusive and transparent way to make decisions that can benefit all of us. I think we need to share in the benefits and the shortages. It might seem strange to be talking about environmental or functional or ecological flows when we are in such a severe drought and there's so little water to go around, but I think the situation makes it all the more important that we do. A dry or meager river will not be able to provide the ecosystem functions that we depend on and will not help improve the predictability and reliability of Rio Grande water deliveries. So for example, I've been thinking recently about the river going dry in large segments in different parts of the basin in New Mexico, along the international border in Big Bend National Park this summer. You know, and when the river dries, obviously there are ecological consequences, but also how much water is lost when a treaty delivery is made on a dry riverbed. So to speak to what Jack asked, can we do what was done to make the Colorado River Delta pulse flow happen? Can we do that here on the Rio Grande? I think we can. And I think we can jump ahead a bit because of lessons learned on the Colorado River. Particularly, there's good news, is that the current commissioners at IBWC and SELA are interested in this. They're interested in finding ways to work better together as they work on a new minute to the treaty for the Rio Grande. They've been holding public meetings. They're working on a white paper on this very topic. They're doing interviews. I think in terms of political will in that very important organization, I think it's there right now to consider this as a possibility. And that keeps me at least somewhat optimistic in these stressful times. Thank you.
Me too. I'm glad we're talking about now, going the other way. What? It's possible. It's possible. Oscar, please tell us that it's possible.
Gracias. Es una pregunta con jiribilla, Rosario. It's a tricky question. Mira, yo considero que todo es posible. Sin embargo, creo que estamos ante un reto muy importante. Y en la cuenca del Río Bravo, en donde se lleva esta discusión, que es en el Consejo de Cuenca, el problema es que esta situación se ha politizado. Y cuando el factor político entra en una cuestión de agua, en donde todo esto representa al final del día votos, se vuelve una situación muy difícil de manejar técnicamente, ¿sí? Nosotros en el Consejo de Cuenca, ahí en ProNatura Noreste, como usuarios ambientales, hemos trabajado muy de la mano con Samuel Sandoval en el desarrollo de un sistema o un modelo en donde se representan los flujos ambientales. Y creo que se ha hecho bien, se ha demostrado que se puede, aun y cuando no existe el agua o la concesión para uso ambiental, es posible manejar los flujos desde la cuenca alta hasta la desembocadura del río Bravo, en el Golfo de México. Es posible hacerlo, ¿sí? Sin embargo, ¿qué se necesita? Se necesita la voluntad política, pero mientras exista en el discurso político que el agua es propiedad de unos cuantos, es muy complicado. ¿Por qué? Porque, bueno, en México el agua es propiedad de la nación, así lo indica nuestra Constitución mexicana. Y en el discurso político, lo que ha imperado es que el agua es de unos cuantos y que el agua les pertenece a unos cuantas personas. Entonces, esa situación, cuando tú entras a un espacio a discutirlo con los usuarios, esa situación hace que pues, realmente el diálogo se rompa y no se pueda llegar a los acuerdos. Y desafortunadamente también esto hace que perdamos toda la inercia y todo el trabajo que estamos haciendo de manera técnica. Entonces, pues básicamente sí se puede, pero creo que el reto va más allá. Y yo lo que no quisiera es que al final del día, si nosotros los usuarios no nos podemos poner de acuerdo, al final del día los que van a tomar las decisiones, bien o mal, o como sea, van a ser las autoridades. En este caso, por ejemplo, la SILA y la IBWC. O por ejemplo, la Conagua. Ellos van a determinar cuándo liberar el agua, qué cantidades liberar y cómo hacerlo. Y eso, finalmente, a todos los usuarios nos va a dejar sin cumplir nuestras expectativas, ¿no? Entonces, yo creo que es un gran reto de que se puede, sí se puede, pero se necesitan recursos, se necesita determinar bien los objetivos y ver quiénes van a participar. A través de la obtención de concesiones para uso ambiental, nosotros logramos en Cuatro Ciénegas salvar una parte de ahí del valle. Creo que es posible a través de la compra o la adquisición de derechos de agua, en algunas partes muy estratégicas, conseguir fondos para establecer en algunas partes, digamos, estos flujos ambientales. Y a través de esto, como ya están sustentadas a través de una concesión, pues se tienen que respetar y se tienen que medir. Entonces, probablemente, no sé en Estados Unidos, pero en México se puede optar un esquema de este tipo, al menos para comenzar en algunas partes de la cuenca a establecer estos flujos ambientales. Por mi parte, aquí termina mi participación. Gracias.
Thank you, Oscar. And thank you. We have now some ideas on how we can do this. We have talked about scale. We have talked about strategies. We have talked about political will. And we have talked about sharing shortages. I like that, Amy. We need to share water as well as the shortages in our scale and proportions. So I want to give you 2 minutes, 2 last minutes to each one of you before we go to the questions, just to wrap up. And the last question, you already talked a little bit about it, but I want you to use it as a wrap up. What are the low-hanging fruit places? That sounds phrase or strategies for implementing environmental flows. And we already talked a little bit about that, but I want you to use it also as a wrap-up statement of your last 2 minutes before we go to questions. And I'm going to start again with Stephanie. Is it okay we start with you? Are you still here with us? Please be with us.
I'm here. Wow. I guess I'm gonna go off to script or whatever, not that there really was one, but I'm kind of a strong pessimist, and yet there's still the optimism of that we can find ways. I mean, we can find ways to, for me, it's almost, deal with this impending, this current state of affairs as far as, very little water in the system and likely to keep being that way. I'm a pessimist because I always think about the political interests and I don't mean political big P, like parties or government, necessarily, although that's part of it, but even down on the local and regional levels of politics. So, the people in one region that are going to have more sway and influencing things are not going to be, they're going to be certain groups of people and not other groups of people. And so the pessimist in me thinks that circumstances will push folks at different levels into action out of necessity, and that some people will suffer. And the ideal would be that not be the case, but I think that's something that has to be kind of clearly kept in view. That some people are not going to be able to participate very well. They're not going to be able to change very well, adapt very well. So because they don't have the resources, because they don't have the capital resources, and they don't have the sway, perhaps. But the other side of it is, I guess, when I was saying that looking at the examples where people are pushing the boundaries, I really do think that is also where you start to push the system above. Like it's by people actually on the ground saying, this is what we're going to do, and start doing it. And that creates not only a pathway for the folks above to look at and see feasibility or potential feasibility, but it also, it puts pressure on them. And that includes things like having the data. We've several of us have been talking about having the right data, having the correct kind of data as far as the flows and things like that. But it also means the correct data from the people, about the people involved, what's at risk for them, you know, what for different people, different usuarios, different users, you know, where do they have room to move? Where do they have room to change? What are the ways to help them do that? Change meaning adapt to a new water regime that hopefully includes environmental flows, but push could come to shove and it won't, you know. So I just think that's really important. And then I think that we talk about, you know, getting together and having different viewpoints expressed or included, but that is super, super challenging. And so it's often talked about, but rarely achieved. And I think we see some examples of it, but I think that being aware that not everybody gets to participate equally is really important, and that there may be differential consequences for different people. You know, some people worse and others less. That's my feverish rant.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie, very much. Jack, you have your 2 minutes of wisdom?
Yeah, let me try to be quick. Well, maybe two reasons for optimism. The Colorado River is fully appropriated. There's not one drop of water that makes it to the sea. Now the flows are about 20% less than they were in the late 20th century. We got an overappropriated river, and yet the discussion includes how can some small amount of water be reserved for environmental purposes in the Delta? That ought to give everybody hope that an issue can move that far. It's not going to be easy. As I said, it's not going to involve the river at all. It's going to involve routing water through irrigation canals, but at least there's some water for the environment. Second thing I would say is realistically, the resources of much of the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo are far more exciting to be celebrated than the resources of the Delta. No offense to people in the Delta. The lower canyons of the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo is an outrageously wonderful place. I would argue that you ought to start in a place like that. Start in the best place. Wage the campaign. Stop, be very specific in where you're talking about. Forget about any conversation about the El Paso Juarez Valley. I'd forget about the Forgotten Reach. I'd probably just focus on the lower canyons and how to make the lower canyons one hell of a place and what flows do you need. And I would just say there needs to be a national level campaign to put this on the tip of the tongue of every person who cares about restoring rivers. And you need books, you need publications, you need a national campaign, you need a well-funded leader and organization to do that. You need coffee table books. But if you get that, you can get there. It is an immense, immense challenge given the complications of the politics of water use in the Rio Conchos, but it is possible.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you. More ideas, more ideas. Amy? You.
Sorry. Yeah, first of all, I just want to echo what Jack said, is that the lower canyons are an outrageously wonderful place. And if you've never been there, you should go. Definitely a place worth protecting and conserving and being good stewards of for so many different reasons. But like I said before, you know, we are really fortunate right now that the current commissioners at IBWC and SELA seem to be interested in having discussions on this topic and to be seriously considering nature-based solutions. I think it's very important to be talking about flows, whether we call them environmental flows, functional flows, treaty deliveries, or something else, in the broader context of river stewardship and management. Functional flows are important, are very important to sustain the river, but they are only one aspect of river stewardship. So when we think about low-hanging fruit, we can think of other actions that would complement functional flows and support the river. So I participate in some partnerships and collaborative groups focused on the Rio Grande. Some of them focused on the binational segment, one of them focused basin-wide, including the Rio Grande joint venture, which is focused on the binational segment. And we're working on some recommendations to IBWC and SELA that could be considered in the new minute to the treaty that they're currently working on. Specifically, we are recommending the formation of an adaptive management work group that could bring additional knowledge, science, and expertise about how the river functions to the water management decision-making process. We believe treaty deliveries can be managed for multiple objectives, including sediment management, water quality, flood mitigation, and improved habitat for birds, fish, and other wildlife, supporting river-dependent lifeways and economies, as well as recreational opportunities. These are all things that the river can do. This can be combined with controlling invasive species, invasive riparian plants along the main stem, and restoration activities like revegetation and low-tech process-based techniques in the tributaries to slow water and retain sediment so that less of it reaches the main stem. So again, just thinking about that low-hanging fruit and things that we're already doing now and can do more of. And really, I think the first step is probably improved communication in several of the ways we've already talked about today. So for one, this could mean that when treaty deliveries are made, scientists are alerted so that they can measure and monitor the impacts of different flow regimes on the river. This will help us get at that data and information that we need to understand what functional flows would look like. So this is definitely low-hanging fruit that could help us make big steps forward. And then secondly, how can we, those of us who see the river more holistically and recognize how she functions to support human life and the life of all our relations, how can we get this message across to a broader public and all the sectors concerned about water in the river? So some of the things that Jack mentioned as examples. I also recently learned that the Salazar Center out of Colorado State University is taking a big interest in the Rio Grande Basin. They're starting to host some webinars. They have a conference coming up that's going to have a big focus on the Rio Grande and hopefully bring, some of the lessons learned from folks working on the Colorado River. So maybe they can help us out with some of these communication needs. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you, Amy. More good ideas. I love the way you refer to the river as a she. Never heard that before. Love it. Oscar?
Gracias, Rosario. Yo considero que sí hay posibilidades. Sin embargo, cuando estamos hablando de los flujos y de los caudales ecológicos, hay que tener un panorama, una pintura más amplia. Creo que el mayor error que cometemos quienes defendemos al medio ambiente y defendemos los flujos ambientales es que dejamos de lado lo demás y solamente nos enfocamos en los flujos. A mi parecer, no solamente deberíamos enfocarnos en cómo dar agua al ambiente, sino considerando que en la cuenca cada vez somos más personas, cada vez cuando hay una situación de sequía como la que estamos pasando, hay menos agua. Es decir, cómo nos adaptamos nosotros como sociedad y cómo nos adaptamos lo que nosotros hacemos hacia esa cantidad de agua disponible. ¿Por qué? Porque cuando se realizó o cuando se realiza el cálculo por parte de, en este caso, por ejemplo, de la Conagua, para ver cuánta agua le toca a cada quien, se hace con relación a una cantidad de agua que no siempre se va a tener. Entonces, realmente nunca se utilizan proyecciones con ahora sí que con lo más pesimista. Siempre se realizan proyecciones con bastante agua. Entonces, yo creo que hay que trabajar con la sociedad. ¿Para qué? Para que se consuma menos agua, para que haya un consumo más eficiente. Y básicamente también me parece importante que se trabaje, que se invierta en la tecnificación agrícola. Es muy importante, ya se ha mencionado y todos conocemos que tanto en la cuenca como en México o en el mundo, pues prácticamente la agricultura utiliza entre el 70, 80 y en algunas ocasiones, como en Chihuahua, el 90% del agua para la agricultura. En el caso de Chihuahua, para el agua subterránea. Entonces, si nosotros tuviéramos una inversión para hacer más eficiente el uso del agua en la agricultura y que lo que se ahorra en la agricultura se pueda utilizar para el medio ambiente o incluso para las ciudades, tuviéramos un ahorro muy importante y creo que tuviéramos la posibilidad de entonces definir estos flujos, siempre y cuando se haga desde la perspectiva legal correcta. En México hemos tenido algunos ejemplos de esto en Tamaulipas y se redimensionaron los terrenos de los distritos de riego y se recuperaron los volúmenes de agua. Pero únicamente se invirtió, pero nunca se aseguraron los mecanismos legales para ver cómo se iba a retener esa cantidad de agua y cómo se iba a asignar a otros usuarios. Entonces, en el concepto estaba bien, pero no fue bien ejecutado. Creo que es una área muy importante que se puede trabajar con los agricultores, los distritos de riego, porque además tienen una fuerza política muy importante. Entonces, la inversión y el trabajo con ellos creo que no puede dejar de lado en el sentido de garantizar los flujos ambientales o los caudales ecológicos. Entonces, por mi parte, pues sería toda mi participación. Gracias, Rosario.
Thank you, Oscar. And I'm taking notes as a wrap up of this because we are very short in time. And I just want to share with you a couple of comments from the audience. From Jesus Eliana Rodriguez in the Delta, and I thank you for sharing that, Eliana. In the Delta, everything began with a dream of a few, a dream full of science, will, and effort. So thank you for that. I also have a comment from Jeff Bennett. Don't we know we can move gravel and fine sediment and preserve conveyance capacity with normal dam operations? And from Randall Hansen, don't environmental flows need to be scaled by climate variability and climate change so that environmental flows are scaled to the ongoing cycles and are dynamic in magnitude and temporal distributions? I think we have touched up some of this. If you want to give last comment on these three comments, any of you, before I can wrap up? No, Jack, did you say you? No? Okay. Okay.
Yo quiero hacer un
I just want to
comentario,
wrap
Rosario.
up pretty quickly.
Sí, yo creo que...
Go ahead, Amy.
Gracias. Yo creo que aquí tendríamos que meter a la ecuación, aunque es complicado, de las aguas subterráneas. Considerando que cuando estamos en sequía hacemos una mayor extracción de aguas subterráneas pensando que no vamos a impactar los flujos ambientales, y no es así, ya que lo que se impacta de mayor medida son los caudales base de los ríos. Entonces, ante una sequía como la que estamos viviendo y ante una mayor extracción de agua subterránea, el impacto pues se ve agrandado todavía más. Entonces, tendríamos que considerar no solamente aguas superficiales, sino también aguas subterráneas en esta ecuación.
Thank you for bringing that up, Oscar. And that was going to be one of my last comments. And I'm just going to have some highlights here for you so we can take home. Well, I'm home, but to my kids, I'll say. Hope they can get this. We need to change the paradigm, and that's a big, and we've been hearing this. We need to change the way we think. And I like this phrase, I've heard it before. Enough is never going to be enough, right? So we will never have enough anyways. So just, let's share the shortages, as Amy mentioned. We need to keep an eye on differentiated impacts to those populations. Not everyone depends the same way or have the same impact. We need to work on scale. I think that's very important, the scale that we're working on, if we want to look for successful strategies in a small step process. Of course, we need to consider surface groundwater interactions. In here, the base flow is key element of environmental flows. We can't forget about groundwater in here. Of course, communication, and that's part of the forum's, objectives. Try to communicate as much as we can these issues, and also the alternatives, and also how the community is involved and the role that we all have, because we all have a role here, right? Our responsibility, we all share the resource, we all share the shortages, and we should do something about it in our scale and our level. And of course, the political will, it's always going to be there. And I'm also glad to hear that, IBWC and Leal are working pretty intensively. Not just environmental flows, I know they're also working in groundwater as well. So I think there's signs, there's momentum, there's drought, and there's something that we all need to do. So thank you all our speakers greatly. I mean, we learn a lot every time that we meet, and with you today, it's been a pleasure to have you today. So thank you, Stephanie, Jack, Amy, Oscar, for being here today. We are recording this and we're going to share this with you later. I want to remind everyone, if you want to help us, donate whatever you can. The link is there in the chat, or you can go directly to our site. We will have a new site coming up, so wait for that news. You're gonna love it, we love it, and it's gonna be up there live pretty soon, and we're gonna share news with you. With that, I'm going to thank again all of the audience that was signing up for this event today, to our speakers, and I'll see you next time. Gracias, gracias a todos. Gracias, Oscar, Stephanie. No sabía que hablabas español. Amy, gracias. Jack, I don't know if you speak Spanish or not, but gracias. Gracias a todos.
Gracias por la invitación. Hasta luego.
Gracias, Jerry, Saúl, Gaby, everyone.
Hasta luego, everyone.
Gracias. Hopefully I didn't miss anything, and I'm gonna